Hello and welcome back to Will's World of Reviews and More. Today we are going to be discussing a topic which definitely inspired by Estee, the Power Rangers YouTuber, who did a video on the problem with Mighty Morphin in terms of Power Rangers and how a lot of Power Rangers merchandise, nostalgia, company preferences is based heavily on Mighty Morphin. When obviously there's been 30 years of Power Rangers and so many different generations now growing up with different generations of Power Rangers, yet it seems Mighty Morphin is still the pinnacle in many people's eyes and therefore is probably the best moneymaker. He went in to talk about the merchandising element of it and everything else. But I thought it was quite an interesting debate really, because I don't think it's isolated to just Power Rangers. It's not just a Power Rangers fandom thing, and so I've got kind of three examples and two sort of exemptions, and potentially we'll get into those as well. So obviously the first one we'll discuss is Power Rangers. So yeah, it's difficult for me to have an unbiased opinion on this because, as described in my Power Ranger video, I grew up with Mighty Morphin. That was my generation. Probably Zeo was probably should have been my generation, but because of all the Mighty Morphin reruns even at that time, and my dad had taped them on VHS and I was watching them constantly, and I didn't realise that they'd kind of moved on to Zeo and then Turbo. I do remember watching the movie, the original movie. So, but even from an unbiased point of view, you know, it is very top heavy with Mighty Morphin things. And is that because it's the original, the most popular for its time, the current state of us as millennials and how we perceive nostalgia, and it's our nostalgia? You know, were people when we were younger, you know, still nostalgic about programs from 30 years earlier? I think so too. But obviously we live in a different consumerist world now in terms of what we all spend our money on. You know, in 30, when, you know, we were kind of watching Mighty Morphin, and, you know, our parents who remembered stuff from 30 years ago, they weren't exactly going to go out and buy a figure of, you know, Dad's Army or 40 Towers or something like that, because they just didn't exist, you know, and people spent their kind of excess cash on other things, you know, maybe going out more, drinking, smoking, socializing, all that stuff that, you know, potentially us as a generation do not do. So I do think there's an element of it making sense, and potentially, you know, in 10 years time you'll have people just as obsessed, and maybe companies with different generations of things, and maybe companies will respond in kind depending on how and where we are as people, I guess. But I guess it's kind of happening already. It just all, obviously for Power Rangers specifically, it depends on where Power Rangers goes. So yeah, that's the first example. The second example I'm going to use is Pokemon. So again, I was unfortunate, depending on how you look at it, to grow up with the original 150 Pokemon, and, you know, again, with nostalgia lenses on, that's the one that draws my attention. You know, at one point it was so big. I had the cards, the game, the figures, watched the program religiously, you name it, had all that stuff, and I could probably at that point, maybe now not so much, I could reel off the first 151 Pokemon in order, including their, you know, all their evolutions and stones that they needed to be evolved with, etc. All that stuff, you know, and some of it still remains to this day. But is there a similar problem in Pokemon in terms of are we, again, from being that age, remembering the original 150 as the pinnacle, and how does that impact Pokemon? I'm not sure. I mean, it's obviously going through another renaissance at the period at the moment, after, you know, some dark years for them there, and they struggled themselves, I think, to ride that wave after the you know, the amazing success that they had early on, to trying to carry that on and try and develop new Pokemon. And I think now probably there are because people play the games and you had your own starters and your own generation. I think it's less of an issue for Pokemon. They seem to have managed it, but you will often see, if there's like a 3-pack of figures, there may be 2 newer Pokemon, but then the third one would probably be from the original 150. It might even be Pikachu, Eevee, Charmander, Squirtle, Bulbasaur, someone recognizable. And then the other 3 packs with the less recognized Pokemon are probably more for other collectors who are different generations. But I would argue that anyone who grew up with the 150 and didn't have any Pokemon figures and saw one that had Pikachu or someone like that in it, they will probably go for that one. And Pokemon probably riding it out to the point now where it's probably not so much an issue, but it is still very heavy. Most Pokemon stuff is from the original 150. Charizard being the ultimate example. He has surpassed Pokemon pop culture. Anything, it is just ingrained now that almost Charizard is the Pokemon for most people. My favorite Pokemon is Charmeleon. I think his attitude had just related to his attitude so much, which says a lot about me as a kid. So yeah, that's one that I think it potentially has the potential to move forward pretty quickly, and probably already has. The third and final example that I could think of, I'm sure there's more, I might do a part 2, is the third example is probably WWE. Sorry, my son's just interrupting the video. So similar, the time that I got into wrestling, it was the Attitude Era, and the issue that wrestling still has to this day is a case of everybody remembering the time that they grew up with something. And for me, again, being in the Attitude Era, or kind of the tail end, actually it's probably a lie, again, it was more just down to being close to it, because I probably started watching 2000, 2001, so it was the very, very end before we shifted into WWE buying WCW. But also all the Attitude Era stars were pretty much still there. So, and to this day, you even just take a look at the most recent WrestleMania main event, where you had like The Undertaker, The Rock coming back in that match, John Cena, who was obviously around at that time, coming up at that time, and there was still, they get a big pop. Some of the older legends now, who other people grew up with, don't get as maybe a bigger pop, because the people who watch them and help them get into wrestling maybe are not as on screen as much. And I think probably WWE are struggling with this as much as Power Rangers is struggling with the MMPR problem. It seems like constantly we're reminded of Attitude Era, and essentially now with Triple H and Shawn Michaels running things, it's even more so. How do wrestling get past that? I don't know. I think they struggle. I think they're struggling to get that same kind of those ratings, obviously, even though it is going through a boom period. And let's just hope that some of these wrestlers that are just starting out now become, as iconic as the Attitude Era. And I think slightly with the Ruthless Aggression Era has got some nostalgia now. Obviously, PG Era even has, and obviously the Now Forever Era, with a lot of wrestlers maybe such as The Shield getting very, very fondly remembered, the Wyatts, etc. And there's a lot of nostalgia there too. So how do they fix this problem? Obviously, I don't know. I do think it will just be a natural progression. I'm assuming that we are a little bit behind in them all, but I'm assuming in 10 years' time, completely different landscape for them. They'll have a new generation of people who remember their generation of all of these products. Two kind of exceptions to the rules are, one big exception to the rule tends to be comic book films. Obviously, there's a lot of nostalgia for, like, say, the original Spider-Man film, but because you then had the Amazing Spider-Man, different generation, you then had obviously the Tom Holland Spider-Man, but ultimately, because they are based on source material that is ever changing in terms of comics, I think that helps them to then introduce new characters such as Miles Morales. And, you know, yeah, there's going to be kickback, but, you know, for him to be in the place that he is now and the amazing Spideyverse films, you know, he will be his own phenomenon in like 10, 15, 20 years time, 30 years time, where people will go, that's my Spider-Man, that was my introduction, that's what I remember. And I do think the fact that he was based on comics, how they're all based on comic characters, the same can be argued for any kind of like adaptations of novels, different versions of like classic books, and some people will argue, well, that was the best version because that was their first introduction to it, even though it might have flaws and might not be as good. So, you know, Spider-Man's an example. Batman, similarly, people might have high nostalgia on certain bits, whether that's the Tim Burton's, whether it's 1966 Batman, whether it's the most recent Batfleck even. There might be some people out there somewhere who that is their Batman. Again, based on the comic material, I think they can ride that out, you know, and they're constantly evolving. It seems like now we're going to be constantly in production of new Batman films, new Spider-Man films, you know, whatever it is, they'll reboot it. So Marvel and DC, I've got it down, and I do think that a lot, they have to be praised for the fact that they're constantly evolving and they're pushing it, but also it makes it a lot easier with them being based on comics. So yeah, that's kind of my thoughts. I think, you know, all these three huge fandoms will continue on for many, many years, and companies and TV companies, toy companies will respond in kind. So yeah, I hope you've enjoyed this video, something different, and thank you for watching, thank you for listening to my weird ramble and putting up with all the distractions in the background. I'll see you soon. Peace, love and prayers. Bye.